front line of regulatory debate, and what we just heard about marketing restrictions. So instant games, big issue. Communication, sharing through new channels, permanent innovation. And if you don't have an innovative product, you might want to find innovative marketing channels or distribution channels. So you can already see that operators are basically caught in that corner where they want to provide these new customers with attractive offers, but at the same time they are scratching, or they are bending boundaries in terms of regulation. So I think this is why this will become a much fiercer battlefield in the future, I think.
I think one of the things that Jessica touched on was around the increasing desire from millennials for entertainment. And one of the reactions from certain industry participants in that sense has been to focus on what people call gamification. I think everyone has a different idea of what that means, but there's an inevitable danger with the entertainment and gamification in a social responsibility sense. It's to some degree playing into the hands of people who say, for example, it's appealing to children, because typically speaking, an element of gamification might involve animation. It might take you down a direction which potentially leads to more troubles on a different front from a social responsibility perspective. So that's, and also in some senses, new innovation around products and the need for new innovation around products creates issues in terms of regulation. How do you regulate those products? Is it licensable? Isn't it licensable? And people looking for an edge around that and giving regulators more scope to put their arms around new products in an environment which is becoming increasingly prescriptive in a way perhaps it wasn't in the past. So some of the steps that the industry is taking to try and appeal to a younger audience can be fraught with danger.
If I may just even contribute from Malta's perspective to the millennial age bracket is probably what also drove a phenomenon like daily fantasy sports, and that being created as a category of regulated game, even though there were arguments about, is it a game of, well, it's a game of skill. Yes, so we classify it as a controlled skill game. And this was a phenomenon driven by market demands, where operators were looking to get regulated to have, to be able to target this phenomenon, this new segment of the market, which was composed, I would say, primarily of millennials. At least that's what we understand. I don't have the statistical information, but it's clear that this was a phenomenon being driven from the younger generations. And it's clear that the industry is going to have to keep adapting to the demands, the requirements that is being created by the market as these millennials and even the generations after them will grow into the industry.
You started this process like a year ago?
It was just 2 years ago, 18 months ago, yeah.
And you have how many licensees, do you know?
In total, there's about, no, just saying daily fantasy sports, but there's people from the MGA who will confirm that, but it's a handful. It's not that many.
And the regulation is looking at this from a social perspective with specific focus on daily fantasy games?
Well, from a social, as in the problems that it creates, is, again, I mean, Malta's in a very particular position. Malta is, as you know, a jurisdiction where there's a number of operators based there. It is not for the market, for the Maltese market, but as a base, as an international center that has set to regulate gaming from the very early stages just after, in the year 2000, just after that. And for that reason, I think there are, as we will discuss later on, even the financial considerations of how does one go around creating a fair environment to make sure that the point of consumption is getting its participation in collecting revenue to deal with the social gaming problems that are created there. So Malta is looking more to accommodate operators to the extent that they can within the regulatory framework. And as you know, we've modernized our framework only from the 1st of August this year, we've rolled out a new regulatory framework based on the experience over the past 18 years. But the social element is something that the Gaming Authority remains very sensitive to. The creation of so social funds, gaming funds, and how that is channeled into the local market. But there's also discussions to be had beyond that internationally, how the Maltese regulatory environment will help point of consumption regulators then deal with the social problems that are created there.
Well, talking about regulatory intervention, David, I know your government is recently taking steps into that direction. And perhaps we should touch upon the retail business as well. Because I know, the decrease for the stakes for the fixed odds betting terminals from 100 to £2 has created a stir for all of us.
Yeah, it comes back to some of the points that were touched on in the first session this morning with regards to the fixed odds betting terminals. The very negative press created, they were called the crack cocaine of gambling, and the industry didn't effectively lobby enough. There was lots of fighting, the operators couldn't come together with a consistent message. Some perceived the ban might be an advantage to them, so rather than come together and try and create research and hard facts to try and counter some of the misinformation in the press, it ended in a pretty huge sweeping change in terms of stake restrictions on these machines in retail shops, to the point where the likelihood is that many shops will have to close as a result of that, resulting in job losses. The danger for the industry, and the Gambling Commission in the UK, as part of their strategy, have clearly stated that when it comes to online, if the industry does not learn the lessons from that exercise in terms of being in a different environment where it's not anonymous, where you can control the data, where you need to look at the data, you need to examine the data, and you need to find trends, and you need to spot problem gambling, people who are potentially at risk of becoming problem gamblers, and nip it in the bud at an earlier stage. And there's messages that you should be investing as much in compliance as you are in marketing. The direction of travel is quite clear. Unless the industry begins to address problems around, notwithstanding that there was statistics published yesterday by the Gambling Commission to indicate there hasn't been a rise in problem gambling, they still think for those who do have a problem or potentially might have a problem, not enough is being done. So if the industry doesn't harness this data and doesn't use it effectively to interact with customers, then there's a risk that these fairly huge restrictions which are being placed in terms of session times, in terms of stakes, in retail shops could come to online, which would have a huge impact.
So going back to online, if we are to think of the measures that could be taken by the operators without regulatory intervention, what would those be? They would use artificial intelligence, they will use data analytics, they will simply enforce limitations by their own rules, or how would you see these coming? All of you, actually.
I think a lot of businesses are already investing heavily into data analytics. There's a lot of discussion about how information can be shared across the industry. Some initiatives, some pushed forward by the industry with the support of, in the UK, of the Gambling Commission around self-exclusion schemes. There are various things which can be done, but I think there's a fear that to some degree some of the guidance from the Commission is identifying problems, but it's not being very prescriptive in how you're supposed to deal with them. And some of the issue operators are getting quite fearful because the Gambling Commission is becoming much sterner in its enforcement strategy. That some people from other markets who come to the UK say, I just want to know what I have to do. What do I have to do? Give me a box. Give me a, so I can just tick all these boxes and I'll do it. But very much the Commission is inviting the industry to work together and to devise programs which it thinks is helping things. And so it's really, a lot of the onus is left on the operators to come up with this investment in, whether it's AI, data analytics, and to try and feel their way through to find something that, if there are operators who simply aren't making an investment in this, they'll be the ones that get caught out. I don't think the Gambling Commission is necessarily going to hang people out to dry if they've actually tried to, if they've made a real effort in this regard.
I want to linger here just a little bit because there is also, similarly to what has been said in the previous panel, I see very little gain from a commercial perspective to implement rules that are not clearly laid down to you. So we were talking earlier on about KYC processes where, okay, fine, you need to establish that the player has a certain financial leverage so that their whole family life is not disturbed by their gambling activities. But then again, just putting down the data like I'm a lawyer, so I make you should be money. It's not. You should be making money. It's not sufficient. Data analytics would help with that. But then again, it's a question of big operators implementing perhaps such systems versus the smaller ones who don't have the leverage to do so. So from this perspective, how do we see the future, I guess? I mean, the regulator, you were saying, has tried to appeal to self-regulation for the operators, but if that doesn't happen, are we likely to see extreme bans, extreme measures taken? I mean, this one for the retail seems like rather extreme and would definitely have a commercial impact, at least from the outside, from a different jurisdiction. This is how I view it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that in the UK they're looking to do is to consult on what they're calling affordability checks to try and deal with the issue you're talking about, rather than just saying, well, someone's a company director, which means they must have lots of money. And looking, but I mean, it can only go so far. An affordability check is going to be based on, whichever way you go, a certain level of assumptions, and will only. You're right in the sense that a lot of the regulation and the developments in regulations, especially for operators who operate in multiple jurisdictions under multiple licenses, the compliance cost is becoming enormous. I guess it's great for most of the people in the room, but the danger is that it does result in fewer operators in the markets, which arguably is not great in terms of people potentially innovating and people potentially giving customer choice and flexibility. So we come back to the age-old issue that we always discuss at IMGL events, which is, is there some way of trying to get a more consistent system across a number of jurisdictions with regards to something like social responsibility? But I think that ship probably sailed quite a long time ago.
Cosmin, if I just may interject here too. It's great to talk about big data, the sophistication of technologies to be able to identify problem gaming. But the truth is that I think if we take out all that noise and we look at things with a bit of a common sense approach, if we were an operator and problem gamers tend to be a very small percentage from the statistics that we were even sharing with us before this panel, it seems like there's something like 1%, give or take, of players who are problem gamers. So that is not a huge amount of gamers. That already puts things into perspective. I think patterns of problem gamers tend to be very obvious that there is something underlying there which is problematic. The volumes that a problem gamer would play, the regularity of logging in, the amounts being lost, the impulsivity perhaps of certain decisions. Unsurprisingly, there's a link between consumption of alcohol and how compulsive one becomes under the influence of alcohol. But if operators tended to implement policies to monitor the activity of players, to see which players should be really honed in on and zoned in on, to stop them being problematic and perhaps to safeguard their not perhaps, but definitely safeguard their reputation. I think, to answer your question, the big data and all of that technology is great, the AI, to be able to help weed out the problem gamers, but I think it becomes pretty obvious even to a small operator where the problems lie, which players are potentially problem gamers and creating having social implications of the impact on the household income and all of that. So I think even a small operator could do well in developing a clear policy of having the right structure in place to say, yes, we should stop this player playing the volumes that they are, we should inquire a little bit more. We have had experiences on both sides of the spectrum as external advisors, where you get some operators that conveniently say, oh, we sent an email and there was no response. When we asked, is this in keeping with your income? We never got a response, so we assumed that it was okay. Then you get other operators that really take a much more proactive approach, closing down the account so that you actually place the burden onto the player to then come forward and disclose certain information before they can reactivate their account. So I suppose the technology is great, but on a more common sense, reasonable level, there are approaches to take for safeguarding one's reputation and making sure you are not creating that social problem, so the industry does not create the issue.
Yeah, I'd completely agree on that, and I think it's a lot. It's just about sort of awareness of the industry and the operators, that what they're doing and what they can do and what they need to monitor and how to deal with it, and that can be done. I completely agree by a small operator and a large operator. I think just it does become a problem if you need the staff and you don't have it, and you know, the larger operators will find that more easy to do. But yeah, definitely, I agree that it's yeah, about sort of this awareness, and it can be done.
Maybe two things to add. One is sometimes you don't need to, as an operator, you need to implement something, but you just show there's a plan, there's a record, you know, that, you know, and you're seriously following it up even when you're small and you can't do it like ASAP, but there's a clear will and you can show it to a regulator. The second thing is, you asked, like, will there be more regulation? There will be, just because of what I just said, but also when there is regulation implemented and there are regulators, they want to regulate, they want to keep their jobs, they want maybe some employees, you know, they need to be employed, so there will be more.
I know that in our discussions you were rather annoyed about the lack of consistency between regulations and between jurisdictions, be them regulated. I mean, even within the regulated jurisdictions, you were saying about this lack of consistencies. And when we add unregulated jurisdictions or jurisdictions where regulation is different from one region to another, things become even more complicated. I believe we need to talk about marketing efforts as well in this context, because there would be no social responsibility, responsible behavior if we weren't paying attention to how we present the product to the wider society. So when regulating gambling activities, governments were at liberty to let them trade freely or to restrict advertising. We've seen lately several models that were taken by various jurisdictions, and we are yet to see how it pans out in Italy starting next year. So what is the best model, do you think? Self-regulation, regulatory intervention, like we've seen in the UK, or harsh advertising ban?
Well, I suppose here again there are certain jurisdictional idiosyncrasies that one has to take into account. Again, raising the point that Malta is not the relevant market for the marketing of operators based in Malta. it's clear that operators based in Malta have to comply with the advertising rules in each host state. So then there's a distinction between the online space advertising and then the physical advertising in the actual jurisdiction. I think as an element of self-regulation is in the industry's interest, like we're saying, even the treatment of this, the social aspects, the problem gaming, is something that every operator should be looking at implementing best practices for their reputation and for the long-term viability of their business. There's obviously going to have to be some minimum standards which the state should impose when there is advertising of gambling and betting. It's obviously undesirable that just like you would not advertise alcohol to underage individuals, to children. Again, there should be an element of protection from gaming advertising to, you know, glamorizing it or making it sound like it's a solution to anyone's problems. So yes, there should be minimum standards, but then a large element of self-regulation, in my view, would be the desirable option. But that's my view.
Yeah, I would say self-regulation and regulation, they ideally should go hand in hand. So basically that there should be a dialogue between the regulator or the political level, as the former panel rightly pointed out, and about the right regulation. So the operators need to look into their cellars, what skeletons have they in their cupboards, and really tackle the issues. So it doesn't help to do self-regulation as a cover-up. You really need to be very honest with yourself, and if this self-regulation doesn't hurt commercially to a certain degree, it's probably not the right regulation, self-regulation. And then the aim should be to have a common ground with the regulator or the people who are driving a certain debate, ideally before the debate really starts. Do we agree on these issues, or do you have a different perspective? And then you implement them across the board. Often, I mean, I used to work for the tobacco industry in early 2000s. I mean, we did in Germany self-regulation for advertisement. In Germany, you can still advertise for tobacco products. I mean, crazy. I don't know if this was the result of what we implemented, but maybe it was. So, yeah, this should be, I think, the way forward.
In Romania, for example, we had issues with an existing regulation which was not properly implemented, and then it got abused, and now we are facing another regulatory body which regulates the audiovisual field, who's trying to regulate, does not understand the industry, does not listen to the industry. So we are very likely to go towards a model which would not please not the television stations, definitely, not the operators. And that's certainly a lack of cohesion between the operators. Not even the online operators versus the retail operators managed to agree to a clear mutual understanding. And I'm witnessing exactly what's happening in other territories, and I do hope that the remote associations, the retail associations, will manage to agree on something and make them heard.
Some of the issue about advertising, I think, is not necessarily based on fact. It comes back to political kind of opinion and the view of some members of the public and lobbying groups, anti-gambling lobbying groups. I think, you know, the Gambling Commission in the UK did an exercise to look at whether there should be changes to advertising, and actually they decided that they couldn't see a particular link between advertising and problem gambling. It's not. It may begin someone's relationship with gambling, but they couldn't find a direct link. So they haven't looked to impose huge changes in terms of advertising, but what they have sought to do much more is to focus on the content of the advertising, to try and stop people having calls to action where people are actually proactively being asked to gamble. So that was one area. And also the focus much more has been on advertising which is potentially of appeal to children. So again, it comes back to areas where the industry sometimes is not doing itself favours in the way it's advertising and the manner of its adverts, especially around certain transparency of the way people do their marketing. Unsurprisingly, notwithstanding that probably there are much worse cases in terms of flagrant breaches of advertising, the most complained adverts about any industry in the UK is gambling. More complaints come into the Advertising Standards Authority about gambling than anything else. And some of that is just because people don't like gambling and they're looking for reasons to complain. But it's taken quite a long time for the industry to respond to that, and not responding quickly enough leads to more restrictions.
Jessica, can you tell us a little bit more about how things develop in Germany from this perspective?
Well, Germany, as you know, is a bit of a tricky one. We sort of there are standards somewhere, but seeing as there are no actual licenses out there, or only a few, Schleswig-Holstein being an exception, it's difficult, you know, sort of where to draw the line. What do I actually do? Am I doing this because I have to? Am I doing this because, you know, where's sort of the link, and where's sort of the it's very difficult for operators to navigate through that regulatory situation.
Do they advertise?
Sorry?
Do they advertise?
Of course they do. Of course they do. It's well, it depends on you know. For example, Schleswig-Holstein licensees, they will be accepted by TV stations, and you know, they'll have an easier access to actually promoting their products. And I think that, you know, that's one of the big points and reasons for licenses, that you can sort of market legally and promote your products. And sort of be, you know, openly there in the market. But yeah, there's advertising online everywhere, you know, and that won't only be Schleswig-Holstein licensees. And I think the focus of enforcement at the moment is the advertising, because it's the operations itself that are sort of challenged. So that will be the next step. I think just general standards in advertising will always be relevant. So advertising can't be misleading. I think that is something the industry probably should, you know, maybe take a closer look at how they, not necessarily with regard to Germany. I think, you know, that's a bit of a wild west situation there when it comes to advertising. But basic standards will be, you know, do not target minors, don't mislead your customers in believing that this is actually a you know, something to generate an income with. You know, that those will be universal.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
always
issues to bear in mind.
combination between
Yeah.
minors protection and consumer protection, so fairness to them.
Yeah.
Do you think brand awareness counts? Do you think it helps to promote your business in a wide way, to contribute to good causes? Would that help make this industry more lovable from a political point of view, let's say?
Yeah, and I think that actually ties into the millennials as well, because I think they sort of tend to be
green.
social awareness and sort of want to identify with a brand. And I was recently at the Gamescom in Cologne and learned the word love brand, so that you completely identify yourself with the brand and the values. And I think sort of millennials tend to look for companies and like to spend money with companies that resonates with their values that they have. So I think that is a very important factor on how the brand is created, and if that is connected to good causes or something you can support, I think that really does have an impact.
I think in our experience, at least in Romania, I've seen companies who do implement CSR programs in the gambling industry, but surprisingly enough, they do not want to publicize this. Why do you think that is? I think it's an issue which comes around in other jurisdictions as well.
That's weird. I mean, why? I mean, CSR should be a natural part of a company's general policy. It's not even only linked to gambling. It's good corporate citizen behavior, basically, and it's covering a flank. So if you don't have any program there, you are always, people can always target that. It's important from an employer branding point of view. So, if you want to hire somebody, they will check it. I think it can contribute can be relevant for customers, but there's definitely a political need. It can give you political leverage. I mean, we support UK Sports Aid in the UK. We do a reception in the House of Commons every year, just presenting the program together. No deeper agenda, but just there, be very open about it. We do media, relations on it, and it's well received. And I think it's good, especially like in our area as a private lottery operator. Lotteries are somehow expected to contribute to good causes anyway. So the gamification of a tax, basically. So yeah, it's needed. I don't see any reason why an operator shouldn't do it and should not be outspoken about it. I think it's rather the opposite.
I think one of the challenges is the most obvious area for gambling companies to in terms of charitable donations, is to donate to problem gambling trusts and initiatives and research projects. But naturally, donating to those suggests that the operators are admitting there's a big problem.
To a certain extent, that is regulated. I mean, there is a compulsory.
Well, not in the UK. So in the UK, it's voluntary, and there's some calls for introducing a statutory levy. So many of the operators in the UK, the online operators, they're licensed in the UK, but they're not based in the UK. So there's talk of a statutory levy to, effectively fund problem gambling. That's an area where, it's quite an easy win. If everyone's accepting and saying under regulation they have to have initiatives to be more responsible, and to certainly in relation to problem gambling, to then not be donating to those projects is a bit of an obvious miss.
So, would you say then that we have a problem of funding? Because in the end, all these efforts translate into money. So, if there is no compulsory obligation to fund these initiatives, perhaps without the lack of regulatory intervention, we have an issue of money.
Well, like most discussions, it all comes back around to money. And in this particular case, I think it's fair to say that operators should be expected to contribute to the burden created by the industry in terms of problem gaming. Like we're saying, it's a very small percentage of players that have a problem. The more material you read in this area, it seems pretty clear that this is a psychological state of mind of the player when they are playing. I mean, it is not every beer drinker who becomes an alcoholic. It is not every player at the casino who becomes a compulsive gambler. If we're looking at the online world strictly, well, the physical casinos, I suppose, are easier to control and regulate. But because, from our perspective, we come across more online remote models, my utopic vision would be to have a freer movement of services across borders, at least within Europe, something comparable to what exists in the financial services field, where there is recognition of licenses, common standards, But the point of consumption tax, I think, which was very pragmatically implemented by the UK, true to its nature, is something which should be replicated in several other jurisdictions, because the point of consumption tax recognizes that if you are tackling players in a particular jurisdiction, then it is that jurisdiction that has to deal with the problem gaming, with the enforcement of whether or not the operators targeting players in their jurisdiction are actually complying with the standards. So we're looking at the funding for both an enforcement and even then remedying the, let's say, sick people who cannot resist this compulsion to gamble. So on both counts, I think it is a winning formula that point of consumption is a fair, equitable approach to giving every state its own share of the activity that's going on within their jurisdiction, and also compensating it for having to take on this burden, just like the tobacco industry contributes towards taxes, which then in turn take care of the National Health Service or whatever it is that's in place. So this is my view.
And where the taxes go to the state, we can only assume that the state will do its job and fund these initiatives. Otherwise, it'll just go in other parts of the budgetary.
One lives in hope, right?
One lives in hope. Yeah. Sebastian, from your perspective, do you think that would work? That would be something acceptable for an operator who operates throughout various jurisdictions? The utopical theory that Andrew was exposing us, with the point of consumption taxation.
I mean, we are highly taxed anyway as lotteries. We are always locally taxed, so there's yeah, and I don't see any reason against it. I mean, we are happily contributing. We are actually, our products are quite, I mean, it's part of the product proposition. So lottery players do not play lottery because of the good causes they support, but it's important to know that they do. And it's also sometimes for themselves a justification that they gamble. So it's interesting what we understand. So yeah, I mean, this is one of our core values, and we live it. I mean, what is interesting now, with the millennials, there is a need to a wish of them to decide where the money goes, what it's used for. So so they don't like, there's a tax, the operator pays a tax, and then it goes somewhere into the big coffers of the state, and then they randomly distributed. So we just launched a lottery in the Netherlands called Raffled, specifically targeting millennials. Apart from the fact that you can't win money, because we realized millennials are not so interested in money anymore. They are more interested in life experiences. They can also choose where the money goes, and then they can do it together with friends. So again, this kind of experience sharing. Yeah, we'll see if it's successful. I mean, we just launched it in June, so we'll see how successful it will be. But this is an idea which is targeting directly millennials with their point of view on contribution to good causes, and all that.
Ultimately, what I hear is that it is a matter of also educating the player. It's for the problem gambler, it's ultimately not just a form of amusement, it's a form of winning money. Hence the limitation, because we are not talking about high rollers here. We talk about people who have an average revenue or even smaller. So for these persons need to be educated into their gambling patterns. And it is also a matter of who takes the job to educate the players, whether or not the private operators will take it on themselves to do that voluntarily, or be obliged to do so. And whenever the stick comes, it hurts. So probably it's better to do it yourself.
I mean, I guess others do it as well. We do regular surveys amongst customers, how much they are aware of our customer protection measures, and we track record and we can show it. And I think that's very important. This should be part of the, ticking the boxes, limits, etc., age verification, and all that. But also that to show our customers are very aware what we do in terms of player protection.
I believe our time is up, so if there are any questions from the public, here's the moment. If not, any last comments? Well, then thank you very much. And it was a pleasure sitting next to you here today. So I hope you give a round of applause to all of them.
Cosmina, thank you very much for chairing the panel. That's great to have you on board as a chair, and we look forward to future opportunities. So thank you very much. And please join me in thanking Cosmina and the panel again. Thank you. Okay, it's now time for morning coffee outside. If we come back at perhaps 20 to 12.